Marcus had made plenty of mistakes in his 24 years, but agreeing to give Lily Chen a ride home from college might have been the one that would haunt him longest. She stood outside the campus library with her duffel bag, dark hair catching the late afternoon sun, and when she spotted his truck pulling up, something flickered across her face that he couldn't quite read. Relief, maybe. Or regret. He told himself this was just a favor, nothing more that her brother David would never need to know. But the second she climbed into the passenger seat and pulled the door shut, the air between them shifted into something he didn't have a name for yet. "Thanks for doing this," she said quietly, buckling her seatbelt. Her voice had that same softness he remembered from 3 years ago, back when she was still in high school and he and David were roommates. Back before everything went wrong between him and her brother, Marcus just nodded and pulled onto the highway, telling himself the 4-hour drive would pass quickly if he kept his mouth shut and his eyes on the road. For the first 20 minutes, they barely spoke. The radio filled the silence with some forgettable pop song, and Lily stared out the window at the passing farmland like she was memorizing every fence post. He could feel her presence, though, the way you feel a storm building on the horizon, all potential and no release. Then, about halfway through the drive, somewhere between the third rest stop and the turnoff to Route 9, she said it. "He warned me about you." The words came out casual, almost conversational, but they hit Marcus like a fist to the sternum. He didn't take his eyes off the road, but his hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "What exactly did David tell you?" he asked, keeping his voice level even though his pulse had started hammering in his ears. Lily shifted in her seat, turning to look at him directly now. "He said you were trouble, that you'd break my heart if I let you get close." She paused, and he could feel her gaze on the side of his face, searching for something. "He said you break everything you touch." Marcus felt that old familiar anger rising in his chest, the kind that had gotten him into fights in high school and cost him his friendship with David in the first place. But underneath the anger was something worse. Shame. Because David wasn't entirely wrong, was he? Marcus had a history of screwing things up, of pushing people away right when they started to matter. He'd done it to David. He'd done it to his ex-girlfriend Sarah. He'd even done it to his own family when he dropped out of college and spent a year bartending in Portland instead of coming home. "Your brother has his reasons for not trusting me," Marcus finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. "But that was a long time ago, Lily. People change." "Do they?" she asked, and there was something in her tone that made him glance over at her. She wasn't looking at him with judgment or fear. She was looking at him with curiosity, like he was a puzzle she wanted to solve. "Because I've been watching you for 3 years, Marcus. Every time you came home for Christmas or summer break. Every time David complained about you ghosting him or screwing up another job. And you know what I noticed?" She waited, but he didn't answer, so she continued. "I noticed that you only run when someone gets too close. Not because you're cruel, because you're scared." The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, felt the urge to deflect rising like bile. "You don't know me, Lily," he said quietly. "You think you do because you've seen me a few times over the years, but you don't?" She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached over and turned down the radio, filling the truck with a silence that felt heavier than any music. "You're right," she admitted. "I don't know you, but I want to." The confession hung between them like a dare. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the white lines of the highway, but his mind was racing. This was David's little sister. Off limits. Forbidden. The one person in the world he absolutely could not let himself want. And yet, why? He asked, finally looking at her when they hit a red light in some small town whose name he'd already forgotten. "Why would you want to know someone your brother thinks is poison?" Lily smiled then, a small sad curve of her lips that made his chest ache. "Maybe because I've spent my whole life doing what David thinks is safe. And maybe I'm tired of being protected from the things that scare me." The light turned green. Marcus drove. But something fundamental had shifted between them, some invisible line crossed that neither of them could uncross. He thought about pulling over, about telling her this was a mistake, about turning the truck around and dropping her off at the nearest bus station so she could finish the trip without him. But he didn't. Instead, he let the silence stretch until she spoke again. "Tell me something true," Lily said, her voice softer now. "Something you've never told anyone." Marcus almost laughed. "That's a dangerous game." She shrugged. "We've got 2 hours left. Might as well make them interesting." So he told her. He told her about the night he and David had their falling out, about the girl David had been dating that Marcus had accidentally hooked up with at a party, too drunk to realize until it was too late. He told her about the guilt that had eaten at him for months afterward, how he'd tried to apologize but David wouldn't hear it. He told her about dropping out of school not because he was lazy or directionless, but because he couldn't stand walking past David in the halls every day and seeing that betrayal in his eyes. He told her things he'd never said out loud, and with each confession, the weight on his chest got a little lighter. When he finished, Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He never told me that part." "About the girl being drunk. About you trying to apologize." Marcus glanced at her. Would it have made a difference? She considered this. Maybe. Probably. David sees things in black and white. You wronged him, so you're the villain forever. But I think people are more complicated than that. She paused. I think you're more complicated than that. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to believe that he could be something other than the screw-up David had painted him as. But wanting something didn't make it true. They stopped for gas at a station just outside the city limits, and while Marcus filled the tank, Lily went inside to grab coffee. When she came back, she handed him a cup, black with 1 sugar, exactly how he liked it. He stared at the cup in his hand. How did you know? She smiled. I told you. I've been paying attention. That smile did something to him, cracked something open that he'd kept locked down for years. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her close and test whether her lips were as soft as they looked. Instead, he took a sip of coffee and said, "We should get back on the road." But as they climbed back into the truck, their hands brushed, and the contact sent electricity racing up his arm. Lily felt it too. He could see it in the way her breath caught, in the way her eyes darkened just a fraction. The last hour of the drive was torture. Every mile brought them closer to her brother's house, closer to the moment when this strange, fragile thing between them would have to be confronted or buried. Marcus tried to think of something to say, some way to diffuse the tension, but everything that came to mind felt inadequate. Finally, as they turned onto Lily's street, she spoke. "Drop me at the corner," she said. "I'll walk the rest of the way." He frowned. "Lily, it's fine. I can drop you at the house." She shook her head. "If David sees you, he'll lose his mind. And I don't want our first real conversation to end with him throwing punches in the driveway. Our first real conversation." The words implied there would be others, and Marcus felt something like hope flicker to life in his chest. He pulled over at the corner as she'd asked, and Lily grabbed her duffel from the back seat. But before she opened the door, she turned to him, her face serious. "I meant what I said earlier, about wanting to know you." Marcus swallowed hard. "Your brother will never forgive me if I touch you, Lily. You know that." She nodded. "I know. But maybe it's not about his forgiveness anymore. Maybe it's about what I want." The air in the truck felt charged, electric with possibility and danger. Marcus knew he should tell her to walk away, to forget this ride ever happened, to find someone safe and uncomplicated who wouldn't bring David's wrath down on both their heads. But he'd never been good at doing the smart thing. "Meet me tomorrow," he heard himself say. "The coffee shop on Elm? 2:00. Hey." Lily's face lit up, and the transformation was so stunning that Marcus had to look away before he did something stupid like kiss her right there in broad daylight. "Okay," she whispered. "Tomorrow." She climbed out of the truck, shouldered her bag, and started walking toward her house without looking back. Marcus watched her go, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the engine. He knew this was reckless, knew it would probably blow up in his face the way everything else in his life had. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt like maybe he deserved a chance at something good. Even if that something came wrapped in warnings and weighted with history. He drove home through streets he'd known his whole life, past the high school where he'd first met David, past the bar where he'd wasted a year of his life pouring drinks and avoiding his problems. When he pulled into his apartment parking lot, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from a number he didn't recognize, but he knew who it was before he even opened it. He asked where I'd been. I told him a friend gave me a ride. He didn't ask which friend. Sleep well, Marcus. He stared at the message for a long time, reading between the lines for regret or doubt, but finding neither. Then he typed back, "See you tomorrow, Lily." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. That night, Marcus lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about impossible things. About whether people really could change or whether we're all just stuck playing the same broken patterns on repeat. About whether David's warning had been protection or prophecy. About the way Lily had looked at him when she said she wanted to know him, like he was worth knowing despite everything. He thought about his mother's voice in his head, telling him he had to stop running from the good things in life. He thought about the last time he'd felt this kind of possibility, before he'd sabotaged it with fear and stupidity. And he thought about tomorrow, about walking into that coffee shop and seeing whether this fragile maybe could survive the light of day. When he finally fell asleep, he dreamed of highways that went on forever and conversations that didn't end. He woke up with his heart racing and his phone in his hand, checking to see if she'd texted again. She hadn't. But it was only 7 in the morning, and he had 7 hours to kill before 2:00. He got up, showered, made himself breakfast he didn't eat. He went to the gym and ran 5 miles on the treadmill, trying to exhaust the nervous energy that had taken up residence in his chest. He cleaned his apartment, answered work emails, reorganized his bookshelf, anything to make the clock move faster. At 1:30, he changed his shirt 3 times before settling on the blue one Lily had complimented once, years ago at some barbecue David had thrown. He drove to the coffee shop and got there 15 minutes early, ordered a black coffee, and sat at a table by the window where he could watch the street. Every time the door opened, his pulse spiked. At 2:05, he started to think she wasn't coming, that she'd woken up this morning and realized what a mistake this would be, how much easier her life would be if she just listened to her brother's warnings and stayed away. At 2:10, he was reaching for his keys, ready to leave before the humiliation could set in any deeper. And then she walked in. She was wearing jeans and a green sweater that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, and when she spotted him, she smiled like she'd been worried he wouldn't show. Marcus stood up automatically, some old-fashioned instinct he didn't know he possessed. She crossed the cafe and sat down across from him, a little breathless, a little nervous. "Sorry I'm late. David wanted to have lunch, and I couldn't exactly tell him I had somewhere to be." The mention of her brother should have been a cold splash of reality, a reminder of all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Instead, it just made Marcus more determined. If he was going to ruin this, it wouldn't be because he was afraid. It would be because he gave it everything he had, and it still wasn't enough. "I'm glad you came," he said simply. Lily reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm and sure. "I'm glad you asked." They talked for 3 hours. They talked about her degree in environmental science and his job in construction management. They talked about the books they'd read and the places they wanted to travel. They talked about their families, about the weight of expectations, and the price of disappointing the people you love. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Marcus realized that this wasn't just attraction or rebellion or some kind of revenge against David. This was real. This was the kind of connection he'd been running from his whole life because it required him to be vulnerable, to show up as himself instead of the version he thought people wanted. When the cafe started closing, they walked outside into the cooling evening air. Marcus walked Lily to her car, and they stood there in the parking lot, neither wanting to be the first to leave. "What happens now?" Lily asked, her voice quiet but steady. Marcus took a breath. "Now I tell David, face him, deal with whatever comes." She looked up at him with something like wonder. "You'd do that? Risk losing him again?" He thought about that, about whether some things were worth the risk. "I've already lost him, Lily. I lost him 3 years ago, but I haven't lost you yet, and I think maybe you're worth fighting for." She kissed him then, rising up on her toes and pressing her lips to his, and it was sweet and terrifying and absolutely right. When they finally pulled apart, Marcus was smiling despite the storm he knew was coming. The next day, Marcus drove to David's house. His hands were steady on the wheel, his mind clear. He'd rehearsed what he would say, how he would explain, but when David opened the door and saw him standing there, all the words evaporated. "What the hell are you doing here?" David asked, his voice flat and cold. Marcus met his eyes. "I came to tell you that I'm seeing Lily. And before you say anything, before you threaten me or warn her off, I need you to know that I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago. I've spent every day since then trying to be better, trying to earn back the trust I lost. And I know I can't undo what I did to you. But I can promise you that I will never hurt your sister the way I hurt you." David's face went through a series of emotions, shock, anger, something that might have been betrayal, then finally something softer. Resignation, maybe? Or exhaustion. "She already told me," he said quietly. "Last night. She said if I couldn't accept it, I'd lose her too." Marcus felt his heart stutter. "And?" David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And I told her that if you break her heart, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." He paused. "But I also told her that maybe I've been holding on to anger for too long, that maybe people deserve second chances, even when they don't ask for them." The words hung in the air between them, fragile as spider silk, but stronger than Marcus had dared hope. "I don't expect us to be friends again," Marcus said carefully. "Not right away. Maybe not ever. But I want you to know that I see what I did. I own it, and I'm sorry." David nodded slowly. "Okay. Just that." "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a door left open instead of slammed shut. It was possibility. As Marcus walked back to his truck, he pulled out his phone and texted Lily. "Talk to David. We're okay." "Well, we're getting there." Her response came back almost instantly. "Told you people can change." And maybe she was right. Maybe the version of himself he'd been running from all these years wasn't the only version he was capable of being. Maybe he could be the kind of man who faced his mistakes instead of fleeing from them. The kind of man who fought for what mattered. The kind of man worth loving. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be difficult conversations and old wounds to navigate. Moments when David's protective instincts flared and Marcus's defensive walls went up. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt ready for the work of it. Ready to prove that warnings don't have to be prophecies. That broken things can be mended if you're willing to hold them gently enough. As he drove back toward town, toward Lily, toward whatever future they'd build together, he thought about the question he knew would come. So here it is for you. Have you ever been warned away from someone and ignored it, only to discover they were exactly what you needed? Or have you been the person everyone warned about, trying to prove you're more than your worst mistake? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story made you believe in second chances, hit that like button and subscribe for more slow burn romances that prove love is worth the risk.